Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. Today we are continuing our exploration of the sign of water turning into blood in Egypt. So we're in Exodus chapter 7, picking up in verses 19 through 25. I'll begin by reading from my translation of the Hebrew, and then we're going to consider a couple of questions. Why does God turn water to blood? What is the role of the magicians? And then we'll look at a couple things towards the end of the passage. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their streams, over their tributaries of the Nile, over their marshes, and over all their pools of water, and it will become blood. So there will be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in trees and stones." Moses and Aaron did so, just as Yahweh commanded. He raised the staff and struck the waters which were in the Nile before the eyes of Pharaoh and before the eyes of his servants, and all the waters which were in the Nile were transformed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, and the Egyptians were unable to drink the water from the Nile, for it became blood throughout the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did likewise by their secret arts, so the heart of Pharaoh was firm. He did not listen to them, just as Yahweh had spoken. So Pharaoh turned and went into his house and did not fix his heart even on this. All the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water to drink, for they were not able to drink the waters of the Nile. 7 days were completed after Yahweh struck the Nile. All right, so the first question that we can consider is, why does God choose this sign? What does it mean in an Egyptian context? What does it mean in the literary context of the book? And I think there are 5 reasonable possibilities that we could consider. So the first is that this sign actually echoed an Egyptian text, and it indicates a judgment of the gods, a divine judgment that they anticipated or that they would have interpreted as a great calamity. So the admonitions of Ipuwer, which is a text from hundreds of years before the Exodus, speaks of many calamities, including, quote, "The river is blood, yet one drinks from it. Men shrink from people and thirst after water." So in this particular text, they're still drinking the water, but the river turns to blood. There are a couple of other Sumerian myths that talk about the water turning to blood and not being able to be drunk. That includes Inanna and the gardener and the exaltation of Inanna. So those texts indicate that the turning of water to blood is an act of divine judgment. I don't know whether the Egyptians had access to these Sumerian texts, which would have been from quite some distance away. The Egyptian text at least could have been in circulation, so it could be that this sign is already playing on particular fears that the Egyptians had. Another possibility is that this action mocked the god Osiris. Osiris was one of the chief deities of the Egyptian pantheon, and the Nile was thought to be his bloodstream. It was considered the lifeblood of Egypt. And so to turn it into blood and then make it undrinkable would be a way of saying there's now a failure, like, oh, you think this is a bloodstream, here, let me turn it into blood for you, and now you can't drink it. So it'd be a kind of mockery of Osiris or of Egyptian beliefs about the Nile. A third possibility is that the turning of water to blood would cause the ritual defilement of all of Egypt. This was suggested in Propp's commentary. I'm not so sure that this works, and the reason why is because I haven't seen any evidence yet that blood in general causes ritual defilement. Menstrual blood certainly does in an Israelite context. I don't know enough about Egyptian ritual defilement to know whether this is plausible to consider blood the defiling of Egypt. Fourth and fifth possibilities kind of go together, and these are more literary than historical insights. So the fourth possibility is that this is an appropriate punishment for what the previous Pharaoh did to the Hebrew boys. As you recall, the previous Pharaoh ordered his people to throw Hebrew baby boys into the Nile. And while there's no blood mentioned in that story in Exodus chapter 1, there's certainly the implication that the death of Hebrew boys happens in the Nile. And so if blood is a sign of death, then this could be a sense of just punishment for what's been done to the Hebrew people. The reason why this isn't fully convincing, although there may be an echo here, is that this plague or this sign is actually not that damaging. For 7 days, the people have to dig their own water along the bank. They have to dig up fresh water because they can't drink the water of the Nile itself. But no human actually dies because of it. This is just merely an inconvenience. It's not a devastating plague like some of the later signs will be. So although it could echo the death of the firstborn, I wouldn't consider it a punishment or a just reward for the death of the firstborn. What I find more likely is that this is a sign pointing forward. So although it might draw from what's already happened, it's pointing ahead to what will happen, namely the drowning of the Egyptian army in the Sea of Reeds. So the ultimate fate of Pharaoh's army is death by water. And so this water to blood sign anticipates where things are going. If Pharaoh does not comply with Yahweh's demands, things are not going to turn out well. So this is like an advance warning. And if you want more to read along these lines, you could check out Terence Fretheim's commentary on Exodus. All right, in verse 22, the magicians of Pharaoh are able to replicate the sign. As I pointed out in a previous Torah Tuesday, it's interesting that Pharaoh's magicians are never able to reverse a sign. They're just able to make more trouble for Pharaoh and for the nation. So they're able to increase the judgment by presumably digging up some more water and then turning that into blood, but they're not able to make the water reverse back to drinkable water, which would have been far more helpful in this case. So here, even Pharaoh's own court is condemning him and is bringing more judgment on Egypt. It reminds me of Balaam from the later chapters of Numbers, where he is calling down, he's supposed to be calling down curses, but he's only able to bless the people. His work as a sorcerer has to fall in line with Yahweh's design. We already talked about verse 24, how the people are able to dig for water. I think this shows God's mercy. He's giving them a strong warning, but it doesn't cause any loss of human life. We'll see that as the signs progress, they gradually increase in intensity. And these early warnings are a way of saying, hey, this is avoidable. This kind of judgment's avoidable if you just recognize my power. But of course, Pharaoh makes his heart heavy, and that repentance doesn't happen. And so the later signs and wonders bring greater devastation. Verse 25 tells us that this sign lasted for 7 days, which is interesting because of the 7-day creation story in Genesis 1. It seems very likely that the narrator is wanting us to think of this as a creation story or as an uncreation story. So while Egypt is being brought into disorder and disarray, God is raising up a new nation, his own people, and they're going to begin a new calendar. They're going to begin a new nation later in the book. So that seems significant. One last comment. You might have noticed as I was reading from my translation earlier, a strange phrase, so there will be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in trees and stones. I really am not sure what to do with that final phrase or what it means. There are lots of different opinions among commentators. I haven't found anything particularly convincing. If you have an idea about what's going on with that you have found convincing, I would love to learn about it in the comments below. In the meantime, have a great week.